All right, so today we're diving into renewable energy
Okay.
and how some potential political shifts might impact it.
Right.
Specifically, solar energy and what the new Trump administration and a likely Republican-controlled Congress could mean for it.
Yeah, this is a very interesting time for renewables, especially
Yeah.
for affordable housing. We have some insightful analysis from Nexys Energy,
Okay.
a leading solar developer in Connecticut that focuses on this sector.
Okay.
They've highlighted some potential changes that could have a big impact on your energy choices down the line.
So Nexys Energy is kind of sounding the alarm here.
Yeah.
What's the main takeaway?
Yeah, the main takeaway is that there's a limited window,
Okay.
maybe just 12 months, to really take advantage of existing solar programs before things potentially shift.
Got it. So a little bit of a ticking clock here.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what specific changes are on the horizon then. What's making Nexys Energy so concerned?
Well, there's a lot of talk about changes to renewable energy policies,
Yeah.
especially the tax incentives that have helped solar really take off.
Right.
One of the biggest concerns is the potential repeal or reduction of the solar investment tax credit, or ITC.
Right. The ITC. Can you remind me what that one does again?
Yeah, so the ITC currently provides a 30% tax credit for solar projects,
Okay.
which has been huge in making solar more affordable.
Okay, so 30% tax credit. That's a pretty significant chunk of change.
Yeah.
What would happen if that went away?
It would have a huge impact, especially on projects that are still in the development phase.
Right.
Think about it. A project could suddenly have a 30% funding gap to fill.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So developers would need to find a way to make up that funding somehow.
Yeah.
What would that look like in practice?
Yeah, we could see projects being delayed
Right.
or even canceled altogether if they can't secure the necessary funding.
Yeah.
It would definitely slow down the growth of solar, particularly for affordable housing where budgets are already tight.
So this ITC is a pretty big deal. Are there other incentives that might be on the chopping block as well?
Yes, there are. The Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, introduced some additional bonus credits
Okay.
that are now seen as vulnerable.
Oh.
These bonuses were aimed at boosting American manufacturing and supporting communities transitioning away from fossil fuels.
Okay, can you give me some examples of these bonus credits and what they do?
Sure. There's the Domestic Content Bonus,
Oh, yeah.
which provides additional incentives for projects that use American-made components. This was meant to encourage domestic manufacturing and job creation in the renewable energy sector.
Makes sense. And what about the other bonus you mentioned?
The other one is the Energy Community Bonus.
Okay.
It provides additional tax credits for projects built in economically disadvantaged areas that are often reliant on fossil fuels. It's all about creating jobs, boosting local economies, and promoting environmental justice in those communities.
So these bonus credits are trying to make solar more beneficial for both the U.S. economy and for communities that really need support. What's the argument for getting rid of them?
Well, there are a couple of different viewpoints floating around.
Okay. Some argue that the domestic content bonus, while well-intentioned, might actually restrict the solar supply chain and drive up costs.
So it's like trying to help U.S. manufacturing, but it might backfire and make solar less affordable overall.
That's the concern.
Okay.
As for the energy community bonus, some critics believe that it might not be the most effective way to deliver economic benefits to these communities.
Okay.
They argue that the funds could be better spent on other programs.
I see. So there are concerns about whether these bonuses are really hitting the mark in terms of their intended goals. Now, all of this uncertainty must be making investors pretty nervous, right?
Absolutely. Investors,
Yeah.
particularly those involved in tax equity deals, are starting to get jittery.
Can you explain what a tax equity deal is? I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that term.
Sure, tax equity deals are a common way to finance large solar projects.
Okay.
Essentially, investors put money into a project to take advantage of those tax credits we were talking about. So they're helping fund these solar projects and getting a nice tax break in return. But now with the potential for policy changes, they're getting cold feet.
Exactly. Investors are looking for ways to protect their investment.
Right.
If those tax benefits disappear, that's why they're starting to demand something called change-in-law protections in contracts.
What do those protections do?
These clauses essentially allow investors to renegotiate or even back out of deals if policy changes end up affecting the tax benefits they were counting on.
So it's like a safety net for investors in case the rules of the game suddenly change.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this is a strong signal that the investment community is seriously concerned about the potential for shifts in renewable energy policy.
Okay, so we've got potential changes to the ITC, potential changes to those IRA bonus credits, and investors starting to hedge their bets.
Yeah.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving pieces here. How quickly could these changes actually happen?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And one that developers are grappling with. The Republicans have a couple of legislative tools that they could use to push through changes fairly quickly. One key tool is budget reconciliation.
Okay.
It's a process that requires fewer votes to pass certain budget-related items.
So they could potentially use this to modify or even phase out those renewable tax credits without needing bipartisan support.
Exactly. It makes it much easier to enact changes that align with their fiscal goals.
Right.
And those goals might include reducing federal spending on renewable energy incentives.
That makes sense. What's the other tool they could use?
The other one is the Congressional Review Act, or CRA.
Okay.
This allows Congress to undo recent regulations with a simple majority vote.
Regulations? Like what?
Well, they could use the CRA to repeal regulations related to those IRA incentives, like the rules for the energy community bonuses or the domestic content requirements.
So even if they don't change the tax credits themselves, they could make it harder to qualify for them by changing the rules.
That's right. And that would create a lot of uncertainty for developers.
Mm-hmm.
They could be planning projects based on a certain set of rules and then suddenly have the rug pulled out from under them.
Okay. I'm starting to see why Nexys Energy is urging affordable housing providers to act fast. So far, we've talked about potentially repealing or changing the tax credits themselves, and now we're talking about changing the rules around those credits. Is there anything else that could cause delays or disruptions for solar projects?
There is.
Okay.
Even if we don't see outright changes or regulatory rollbacks, the new administration could simply delay or halt guidance from the IRS and Treasury on how to actually implement these IRA incentives.
You mean like instructions on how to actually apply for and receive these benefits?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Clear guidance is essential for developers to plan and execute their projects effectively.
Right.
Without it, they would be stuck in limbo, unsure about how to meet requirements or if they even qualify for the credits.
So it's not just about what the policies say on paper, it's about how they're actually put into practice. That makes sense.
Right.
Okay.
This lack of clarity from the IRS and Treasury would create a lot of uncertainty and make it much harder to move projects forward.
Okay, so we've got a potential perfect storm brewing here. Changes to tax credits, changes to regulations, and potential delays in guidance. What are developers actually doing to navigate all of this uncertainty?
They're having to be very strategic and proactive.
Okay.
Some developers are trying to speed up project timelines to lock in those existing incentives before any potential changes take effect.
It's a race against time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're also focusing on securing binding contracts and legal documentation that demonstrates their reliance on those existing incentives.
Yeah.
This could help strengthen their position if those incentives are later reduced or repealed.
So it's about building a strong legal case in case they need to fight for those benefits down the road. What else are they doing?
And of course, they're incorporating those change in law clauses we talked about earlier into their contracts.
Right.
They're trying to protect themselves from potential policy shifts as much as possible.
So it sounds like the entire renewable energy industry, particularly the solar sector, is bracing for impact.
That's a good way to put it. There's a lot of anticipation and anxiety about what the next 12 months will bring.
All right, well, we've unpacked the potential challenges.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what this means for affordable housing providers who are considering going solar. What are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the next 12 months could be a pivotal period for solar energy.
Okay.
If you've been considering it for your affordable housing properties, acting sooner rather than later could be the best way to secure those existing benefits.
So it's almost like a window of opportunity closing.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
The potential for these policy changes is creating a sense of urgency in the industry.
So what are the potential consequences for affordable housing providers if they miss out on this window? What happens if they wait and these changes do come to pass?
Well, the most immediate impact would be financial.
Right.
If the ITC is repealed or reduced, the cost of installing solar would likely increase. That would make it more difficult to justify the investment, especially for properties with tight budgets.
That makes sense. Solar is already a significant investment, and losing that 30% tax credit would make it even more challenging. What about those bonus credits we talked about? How would losing those impact affordable housing projects?
Losing those bonus credits would be a double whammy, especially for projects located in economically disadvantaged communities.
Right.
Those energy community bonuses are designed to make solar more viable in areas that need it most.
Yeah.
Without them, those projects could become much harder to finance.
So there's a real risk that these policy changes could exacerbate existing inequality.
Absolutely. Affordable housing providers in those communities would be disproportionately affected.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and dive deeper into some specific scenarios. Let's say the ITC is completely repealed. What would that mean for existing solar projects?
Well, for projects that are already operational, the impact wouldn't be as immediate. They would still be able to benefit from the tax credits they were initially eligible for.
That's a bit of good news, at least.
Yeah.
But what about projects that are in the pipeline? The ones that haven't been built yet?
Those are the ones that would face the most significant challenges. If the ITC disappears, they would suddenly need to find a way to fill that 30% funding gap.
Right.
It could lead to project delays, cost increases, or even cancellations.
So it could throw the entire solar development process into disarray.
Yes, especially for projects that are heavily reliant on those tax credits to make their financial models work.
Let's say the ITC isn't completely repealed, but is instead reduced. What kind of impact would we see then?
Even a reduction in the ITC would have a ripple effect. It would make it more challenging to secure financing for projects, and developers might have to adjust their pricing to compensate for the loss of tax benefits.
And those adjustments could ultimately make solar less affordable for everyone, including affordable housing providers, right?
Exactly. It would make it harder to achieve those cost savings that make solar so appealing.
Okay, so the bottom line is that any change to the ITC, whether it's a full repeal or just a reduction, could have a significant impact on the solar industry and make it more difficult for affordable housing providers to go solar. Now let's talk about those bonus credits again. What are the strongest arguments for keeping the domestic content bonus in place?
Proponents argue that it's vital for boosting American manufacturing and creating jobs in the renewable energy sector. By incentivizing companies to source components domestically, it helps to build a more robust and resilient supply chain here in the U.S.
So it's about reducing our reliance on foreign suppliers and promoting economic growth here at home. What about the arguments against it?
Critics argue that requiring domestic content can actually drive up costs and create supply chain bottlenecks.
Okay.
It can limit the options available to developers, making it harder to complete projects on time and within budget.
So it's a trade-off between supporting American jobs and potentially increasing the cost of solar energy. Where do you stand on this?
It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. The incoming administration will have to carefully weigh the economic and geopolitical implications before making any decisions.
Fair enough. Now let's talk about the other bonus credit, the energy community bonus. You mentioned earlier that this is designed to help communities that are transitioning away from fossil fuels. What are the potential downsides of scaling back or eliminating this bonus?
Well, the main concern is that it could undermine efforts to promote economic development and environmental justice in these communities. These are often areas that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution and job losses in the fossil fuel industry. The energy community bonus is a way to create new opportunities and support a just transition to a clean energy economy.
So it's not just about the environment. It's about addressing economic inequalities as well.
Yeah.
What are the arguments for reducing or eliminating it?
Some critics argue that the energy community bonus isn't targeted enough and that the funds could be better spent on other programs that more directly benefit these communities. For instance, they suggest investing in job training programs or energy efficiency improvements in homes and businesses.
So it's a debate about the most effective way to support these communities and achieve those economic and environmental goals. Now, you mentioned earlier that investors are getting nervous about these potential policy changes and are seeking protections in their contracts. Can you talk more about these change in law clauses and why they're becoming so important?
Certainly, change in law clauses are essentially a way for investors to mitigate their risk in this uncertain environment. They allow investors to renegotiate or even exit a deal if policy changes negatively impact their expected returns.
So it's like an insurance policy for investors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Imagine putting millions of dollars into a solar project based on a certain set of tax incentives, only to have those incentives disappear a few months later.
Right.
It would be a financial disaster.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So investors are essentially saying, we're willing to support solar, but we need some safeguards in place in case the rules of the game suddenly change.
Exactly. And developers are having to adapt to these demands.
Right.
They're incorporating these change in law clauses into their contracts and exploring other ways to provide investors with the assurances they need.
It sounds like it's becoming more challenging to secure financing for solar projects with all this uncertainty hanging over the industry.
In some ways, yes. Investors are becoming more cautious, which could make it harder to get projects off the ground.
But it's not just about financing, right? There are also regulatory hurdles to navigate.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the regulatory landscape for solar and how that might change under the new administration?
Sure, the solar industry is heavily regulated with permitting processes, interconnection requirements, and other rules that developers need to comply with. The new administration has signaled a desire to streamline regulations and reduce bureaucratic burdens on businesses.
So less red tape for solar developers. That sounds like a good thing.
It could be, but it's important to see how this plays out in practice. Some regulations are in place to protect consumers and ensure that solar projects are developed responsibly.
So it's a balancing act between promoting business-friendly policies and ensuring that solar development is done in a way that benefits everyone.
Exactly. And it remains to be seen how the new administration will approach that balance.
So there's a lot of wait and see going on in the industry right now.
Definitely. The solar industry is watching closely to see what concrete actions the new administration will take. There's a lot of speculation which can make planning for the future a bit tricky.
But amid all this uncertainty, are there any glimmers of hope for the solar industry? Is there anything that gives you optimism about the future of solar, even with these potential policy changes looming?
Absolutely. While the political winds may be shifting, the fundamental reasons for embracing solar remain strong. The cost of solar technology has continued to decline, making it increasingly competitive with fossil fuels.
So even if we hit a few bumps in the road in terms of policy, solar is still on track to become a major player in the energy landscape.
Yes, the transition to a cleaner energy future is well underway, and solar will play a vital role in that transition. However, the pace of that transition will certainly be influenced by the policy decisions made in the coming months and years.
And that brings us back to Nexys Energy's advice for affordable housing providers. Act now before it's too late.
Exactly. The current policy landscape is still favorable for solar, and those benefits might not last forever.
It's like that old saying, strike while the iron is hot.
Exactly. Don't miss out on this opportunity to make a smart investment in a cleaner and more sustainable future for your properties.
This has been a fascinating conversation, shedding light on a complex and rapidly evolving issue. We've covered a lot of ground here, but let's zoom back out to the bigger picture for a moment. For anyone listening, especially those managing affordable housing, what does this all mean for them if they're considering solar?
Well, the message from Nexys Energy is crystal clear. If you've been thinking about making the switch to solar, now is the time to act while those incentives are still available.
So it's kind of like snagging that great deal before the sale ends.
Exactly. Take advantage of the current policies and potentially lock in those savings before things change.
Beyond just the financial benefits, are there other reasons why acting now might be a smart move?
Absolutely. The solar industry is rapidly adapting to this uncertain environment.
Okay.
Developers are streamlining their processes, incorporating legal protections into their contracts, and finding ways to minimize risk. By working with a solar developer, now you can benefit from their expertise and navigate this shifting landscape more effectively.
It's like having a seasoned guide to lead you through a challenging and unfamiliar terrain.
Precisely. They can help you understand the intricacies of the current incentives, assess your specific needs, and develop a tailored plan that maximizes your benefits.
Okay, so let's say someone decides to take the plunge and go solar. What are some key things they should keep in mind as they go through this process?
First and foremost, do your research and choose a reputable solar developer with a proven track record, especially one with experience in affordable housing projects. Look for companies that are transparent about their pricing contracts and the potential impact of policy changes.
It's like checking online reviews before you buy a product. Make sure you're dealing with a trustworthy company.
Exactly. And don't hesitate to ask lots of questions. A good developer will be happy to walk you through the entire process, explain the details of the contract, and address any concerns you may have.
As they say, knowledge is power.
Absolutely. The more informed you are, the better prepared you'll be to make the best decision for your specific situation.
We've done a deep dive into the world of solar policy and its potential impact today. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yes, I think it's important to remember that even though the policy landscape may be shifting, the fundamental reasons for going solar are as strong as ever. It's a clean and renewable energy source that can help reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and mitigate the impacts of climate change.
And it can potentially save a lot of money on energy bills, too.
Exactly. So while it's wise to be mindful of the potential policy changes and plan accordingly, don't let that overshadow the long-term benefits of going solar.
Right.
It's an investment in a cleaner, more sustainable future.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been really insightful.
My pleasure. I'm always glad to shed some light on this important topic.
And for our listeners, we encourage you to stay informed, do your research, and consider taking action now while those solar incentives are still shining bright. This is The Deep Dive signing off.